Hi, and welcome back to WVU Mooc. This is the fourth session. This week we're talking about media multitasking, and my name is Elizabeth Cohen, and I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at West Virginia University. So for this part, I think we're going to be talking a little bit less about the media and more about the multitasking part of this week's focus. And what I mean is instead of talking about actual media effects, I want to focus specifically on how the brain deals with multitasking and give you a little bit more of a perspective on what cognitive psychology talks about as the limits of the brain in handling multiple tasks. The way I want to approach this is first we're going to talk about three of the major limitations in the brain, specifically with regards to cognitive capacity, which I'll explain in just a second. And I want to talk about how that, plus the brain's sort of natural sensitivity to interference, leads to what we call cognitive bottlenecks in the brain, where we can only process so many things at one time. So let's start off just explaining one of the more important concepts, which is going to be this ongoing theme that you'll see throughout this whole lecture, which is the idea of cognitive capacity. What cognitive capacity refers to is simply the amount of information that the brain can handle. But we see limits in cognitive capacity come in all different types of processing. So the best way to sort of explain capacity theory is that we have just sort of a finite pool of resources that we can use at any given moment to process different types of information or to perform different cognitive tasks in our brain. So when we don't have any tasks going on, you can see here we have all sorts of resources that we could apply to something. But if we have a really, really demanding task that requires a lot of thought or a lot of concentration, concentration, for instance, takes up a lot more of those resources, which means that we don't have a lot, indicated by the blue here, we don't have a lot of extra resources that we can apply to do additional tasks at the same time. However, if we're doing an easier task that's maybe a little bit more automatic, we've practiced it longer, then we have more cognitive resources that we can put towards accomplishing that task. Okay, so let's talk about where these limitations come into play. So first of all, we have cognitive limitations on our processing speed, how quickly we're actually able to process different types of information. So the best way to think about this is a lot of models of the brain consider it a communication network where we have different neurons, and the way that we actually go through processing is by having those neurons communicate with each other. But the thing is some of the paths between the neurons are better connected than others. There's various reasons for that. Sometimes we've just built up stronger paths and that can the communication can speed across more quickly. So we find that some things can be processed a little bit quicker than other, but again, this also has to do with limited capacity. I would really have liked to have shown you how we measure processing speed when we're talking about how quickly or slowly you can process different types of information. One of the ways they do that is what's called an implicit association test, or the IAT. And what it does is it essentially asks you to recognize, make different connections between two different concepts. And the more quickly that you're able to make the appropriate connection, we know that you have a stronger connection in that communication network, right? The nodes are communicating faster, the processing speed is faster. Unfortunately, it was hard to sort of like embed in here and do a demonstration, because it's really something that I think is better for you to try it yourself. So I left you a link down here if you want to go and try out one of these implicit association tests, so you can see how some things, different biases that you have, for instance, get processed a little bit more quickly. So you can just check this out and do the demos. Those are the ones that are free at implicit.harvard.edu. Another brain limitation that really affects multitasking is these limitations in working memory. So what working memory is basically temporary storage for your brain. You may have heard of long-term memory before, which is the stuff that we store so that we can access, you know, way in the future. Working memory is sort of like that little queue where the information goes before we've decided or even had the ability to put it into long-term memory. Some stuff never even gets into long-term memory, but of course we have it in working memory for a short amount of time. Some people compare working memory to RAM in a computer. Think about how, if you've ever had this happen more than I care to remember, but if you've ever had a computer shut down on you before you're finished working on a particular document, and when you turn the computer back on, not everything has been saved. Not everything has been, if you will, put into the long-term memory of the computer, but it was still functioning in the working memory. So again, just different bins of storage is one way to think about it. So let me just give you a little demonstration on how working memory operates. So this is one task that sort of illustrates the limitations very well. First, find the answer to the following question as quickly and accurately as possible. Questions, actually, I could say. So I want you to read these sentences and then as quickly as you can decipher who came first and who came second. Okay, probably got it now, right? Now I want you to try it. This isn't the same people arriving. They're different people. So I want you to do the same thing with this sentence about Tom and Steve and John and find the answer to the following question as quickly and accurately as possible. But this time, while you're doing it, the whole time you're thinking about it, I want you to say the, while you're coming up with the answer. Okay, you're probably finding this a lot more difficult to do. And the reason for that is because the way that you process these questions about figuring out how the order that people arrived in is you have to sort of hold what you already know about the situation. So Tom arrived after Steve. So you've got to keep that in working memory while you process the next thing. John came before Steve. But the problem is reminding yourself to say the all the time is also using up working memory resources. So when you try to do both of those things at the same time, you'll notice that you're probably significantly slower doing the task right here than you were the first task. Just a couple more facts about working memory. Generally speaking, the capacity of working memory tends to be on average about 7 objects, plus or minus, give or take 2. Although, you know, that's a lot of the research that's found that tends to be how many things we can juggle in working memory at one time. There's some evidence that depending on what the objects are, it could be even less than that. So I've heard figures that our capacity to sort of juggle faces, like human faces, if we're trying to remember what somebody looks like, is only about 2 at the same time. And also, it has about 30 seconds where if we're not rehearsing it, then it'll disappear. So I always, a very salient example to me when thinking about this is, often I'll be doing something, I'll be at the computer, and my husband will say something to me, and there'll be like a short delay while I'm trying to finish my email. And then he'll say, "Did you hear what I said?" And somehow I'm able to repeat back exactly what he said. But that doesn't necessarily mean I had even processed it yet. But because it was in that window of 30 seconds, I could still sort of like recall what he told me and spit it back to him. And at that time, I usually get it. The other interesting thing about working memory is, again, it's not just, it's different than short-term memory, right? It's working memory. What that means is like, oh, not only could you hold 7 objects, like let's say the numbers of a telephone number and rehearse it, and you keep it in your working memory, but also the higher your working memory capacity is, if you have pretty high working memory capacity, you should also be able to read those numbers backwards. Again, just because when it's in that storage, you should be able to quote unquote work with it. Okay. So the third limitation that I wanted to talk about was limitation in attentional resources. Various definitions of attention, but what I love about this one is it talks about not just that attention is how the mind chooses what to focus on one thing, but attention is also responsible for choosing what we need to ignore. An ongoing theme that we're going to see as we keep talking about different aspects of multitasking is that sometimes figuring out what to ignore in your environment is even more important than figuring out what to attend to, okay? So attention only allows some information to enter into consciousness. A lot of people have used the metaphor of a searchlight to describe how attention operates. Because even when we are focused on one thing, we still sort of have peripheral attentional processes that are scanning the environment for other things. And whatever the beam's on gets the most focus, of course, but that doesn't mean that it can't shift if there's some need to. And I think that the best illustration of this is actually what's called the cocktail party effect. I'm skipping down to the second bar here. So essentially, the cocktail party effect is when, and it doesn't necessarily have to be at a cocktail party, but I do think it's an illustrative example. So have you ever been at a party and you're engaged in conversation with somebody, and there's lots of other conversations going on around you, and even though you're fully committed to that conversation, you hear your name sort of like, you know, echoed like somewhere else. And the minute that happens, right, your searchlight of attention just shifts and it goes to where the name is, because that your name is something that grabs your attention and you want to hear things about. That's actually an example of directed attention, where you've selectively decided to attend that new conversation that interests you because, of course, it has something to do with you, possibly. But attention can also be hijacked, meaning like it's not necessarily something you wanted to attend to, but you kind of couldn't help it. Your automatic attention can actually shift in response to something it's coming at you very quickly. You can imagine why this would be a useful thing to have. I mean, it helps you avoid getting hit by buses, for instance. So in some cases, it's not necessarily because you want to pay attention to it, but maybe your attention is suggesting that you should. Now, just like all the other limits, attention's no different. There's all sorts of limitations on the capacity that we have to attend to different things. And to tasks that demand more attention, more focus, concentration, are taking up more resources, making it difficult to attend, to give our attention to other issues. So again, just whole notion, just to go back, last time we're going to see this, this idea of cognitive capacity. If we don't really have much to attend to, then we have all these resources free to dedicate to anything we want to, you know, concentrate on. On the other hand, if there's some sort of task that just requires a lot of, you know, heavy-duty concentration, then our attention's not going to be very full if we try to do something else. And of course, if it's something that doesn't take much to attend to, then we could be doing something that requires greater focus as well. Okay? Do a little exercise. This is what's called the Stroop task. And what you need to do is, you see here there are letters, well, specifically there are words spelled out, but the color of the ink is different than the word that they spell out. So what you need to do is say the color. Do this out loud, I mean, to really test yourself. Say the color, not the word, of each word out loud. So focus on the color that the word is. And do this as quickly as you can. And I'll take a tasty beverage. Okay. If you found that difficult, you're not stupid. It's quite normal, actually. This is a pretty difficult task. But the reason it's an interesting sort of study of attention capacity is because what's actually happening is, like, you're getting two conflicting signals from, your brain's getting two conflicting signals here. When you're asked to name the color of the ink, you probably tended to say the name that the word represents. Like, it's easier, right? It requires less attention for us to read these words. But then when we have this competing signal that needs to be attended to, the fact that, well, okay, what's written is blue, but it's in red, and I need to say red, right? Now your attention's sort of divided at trying to decipher between those conflicting signals. You've got to actually suppress this knee-jerk response to say blue, even though the word is written in red. I can't even do it when I'm talking to you, you see? Again, even though I also think this is an interesting example, because even though this doesn't necessarily seem to be demanding, like in what we would think of as like physically demanding or intellectually demanding, the truth is like what can actually take up our cognitive resources can be simple tasks that just aren't automated, or that mess up something that we're used to, and therefore require more of our attention. Okay, I want to do another task. You're going to get directions here in a second, but in this task you need to dedicate your attention to counting the number of times. You're going to see a bunch of people playing basketball, and you need to count the number of times that people pass the basketball to each other. So see if you can do that. There's going to be quite a few. Oops, my bad. Okay. No! Okay. Slides demand attention too. Okay.
This is a test of selective attention.
No!
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from VizCog Productions.
Okay, little plug there. Okay, so what just happened there? What happened was what we call the attentional blink. This is actually a very, I mean, you can tell, got book deals coming out of this, right? This is a pretty famous study that I'm disappointed to say that I had heard about the study before I actually got to do the basketball passing task. So I never got to test whether I would have gotten to see the gorilla or not. But those who know me would say that I probably would have missed the gorilla. My cognitive capacity for attention isn't always that great. So what is this? Okay, so obviously, you know, the gorilla went in front of your eyes. If you were paying attention to the number of basketball passes, and at some point, the gorilla must have wandered in front of your eyes. So what was your attention doing? Well, the problem is that your attention, all of your cognitive resources, right, were focused on counting those balls, as they should be. Now, I will say, if it was only one pass, you know, if there was only one thing going on, then maybe that task would have been a little less demanding and you would have had more resources to, you know, scope out the gorilla, scope out all the men dressed up like gorillas in the room, right? But the fact is like this, you know, your brain was focused on just performing the task that you were asked to do. Not to suggest, by the way, not everybody in these studies has missed the gorilla. In fact, from what I've read, the people who see the gorilla are completely floored, like what the hell is going on? And they just can't believe that somebody would miss it. Again, not that person, could totally see how that could happen. But the fact that it does happen, and you know, this has been replicated and happens with quite a bit of people, I believe over 50%, really suggests how the nature of divided attention. You can literally, I love this, you can look at something but not see something if you're engaged in another task. Okay, so now I want to talk, we've covered all of these different brain limitations, but in addition to these brain limitations, our brain also has a really, it's very sensitive to different types of interference that can either come from within the mind itself or externally. And this, by the way, includes multitasking behaviors. So what can happen is basically on an internal level, right? You could have what we call intrusions, and this is when your mind wanders. I was talking to some of my students about a take-home exam I gave them, and asking them, you know, what do they feel like is the biggest impediment to them just sitting down and doing, you know, the take-home exam. I was actually expecting them to say that, oh, well, they wanted to go do something on the internet, or whatever the case is, but the truth is they said, well, mine just starts wandering. You're doing something, you're trying very hard to focus, but those little thoughts creep in. So that would be considered an intrusion. And again, it's internal because it's something that happens within you. Diversions also, right? But this is more something that you want to do, like goal-directed diversions, things that you want to like think more about, let's say, that might not necessarily be on task, okay, but still internally motivated, where you want to multitask these ideas. Another type of interference, of course, is from the external environment. For instance, you know, we mentioned the cocktail for party effect before, like when somebody shouts out a name. Now, some of that could be relevant info, things that you want to hear. In that case, we would consider it a distraction. If you got to see the first lecture for this session of the Mooc, I talked to you about my obsession with distracting animal videos. I'm not sure if any of you went back and found them, but there were a couple more screaming goat videos embedded in there. That's sort of definitely a distraction that was something that I wanted. It was something that I was actually looking for. On the other hand, there could also be interruptions, though. So these are the type of interferences from the environment that we don't want. So, for instance, if you're trying to focus on something and, your kids start making a lot of noise or something like that, it's not necessarily something you're looking for, but it still gets your mind off track. So again, what happens now is, just to sort of like put this all in perspective, right? We've got severe brain limitations, and we also have this extreme sensitivity to interference. And all of this stuff makes it really difficult for our brain to sort of figure out what it needs to be processing. The job of prioritizing what needs to be processed falls on the brain's prefrontal cortex. This actually is, I should have put a picture of some sort of bouncer. This would be a good one. They call the prefrontal cortex the brain's bouncer, because really what it does is it decides what information should be processed, what information should be ignored. So what should it do with those different types of interference? And also, given limits in cognitive capacity, where should we, put all of these resources, and how should we distribute these resources into processing things, okay? So the prefrontal cortex is making all of those decisions. The thing is that it used to be that, and actually I would say the way that we talk about multitasking, what does that imply? We're doing two things at once, right? Well, the truth is the way that the prefrontal cortex actually processes things, the way that it's deciding, what gets processed and what doesn't, it's actually rapidly switching back and forth between tasks. So it's really monotasking at a very fast pace. So it goes to this task, it goes to another task. It's not that those two things are going on simultaneously. And this is what's called the myth of multitasking. It's just, it doesn't actually process multiple tasks at the same time. There's always some sort of switching going back and forth in your prefrontal cortex. The problem, of course, is that eventually there can be a bottleneck when so much information's coming in, right? You're trying to handle all of this stuff, and the prefrontal cortex can only do one thing at a time. So you get this bottleneck effect. It's forcing you to just say, like, no, one thing at a time. And it can go fairly quick, but there's limits on that too. And all of the backup, right, just is slowing down how much you're able to process all that information. I have down here, research suggests that it takes about 4 times longer to complete a task while you're doing something else. So that's a significant impediment to you actually accomplishing one task when your prefrontal cortex has to constantly be going back to address the other tasks coming in. So that's pretty much it. I mean, that's consider that is your crash course to, I guess, brain capacity, cognitive limitations. In a nutshell, right, the brain cognitive functions have limited capacity. So they're good at their job, but when you give them a hard task, it means they can't do a whole lot else with whatever limited resources are left. Also, the brain can only process one task at a time, again, because of the prefrontal cortex is switching back and forth, not going at the same time. And so there's a lot of lost time that happens during that switching when we're actually trying to get something done. So this is why, I mean, and if you've read any popular press articles on multitasking, this is why multitasking has a really bad rap, because we know that biologically, right, we are not set up to handle two things at once. Well, we can do it, but when we do it, we're not as productive. We can't do it as quickly. And the concerns with this, I mean, and of course, in the case of texting and driving, or, well, particularly texting and driving, you're not even looking at the road, but with any type of dual task, like medium multitasking, something's got to give, right? Something's got to drop, and that's why this is an important lesson to learn from the brain's perspective. Okay, well, just like we ended the last time, I'd really like to pose some questions to you to get some discussion going, if possible. I mentioned last time we have various social media outlets where you can go and actually discuss this with me and other people who are doing this, learning this content at the same time. We've got Facebook, the Twitter hashtag WVUCommMooc, and also if you go to wvucommooc.org, you can find the discussion boards that are actually linked to this lecture. So two things I want to sort of pose to you. First of all, I'm curious to know what types of media interference, let's bring it back to the media now. What types of media interference do you think you have the hardest time ignoring, and why? Like, what is it that, you know, when it comes into your purview, you just have to pick up that cell phone call, like, no matter what you're in the middle of, or you have to click on that screaming goat video, in my case. And then two, first of all, I think the prefrontal cortex is probably the most fascinating part of the brain. And if you guys get on the discussion boards, I'd love to tell you more about how they made the discoveries about what the prefrontal cortex did, because it was one of the more mysterious parts of the brain, and it turns out to be, I mean, not that any part of the brain is not important. Well, it's certainly a very important part of the brain. I'll leave it at that. So I'd like to talk about, though, how, again, what the implications of the fact that the prefrontal cortex actually happens to be the last part of the brain to develop. And I mean, when I say it develops late, right, we're talking not, this isn't like wisdom teeth coming in. This is much later. This is 20s. I've even seen some figures saying early 30s is when some people finally finish developing their prefrontal cortex. What are the implications of this? Okay, so we're talking, first of all, we're going to talk next time about how young people tend to multitask quite a bit, and what are the implications of them possibly having an underdeveloped, well, that's a terrible word, not underdeveloped, not fully developed prefrontal cortex? Or looking at that in a different way, how might the development of the prefrontal cortex affect our need to multitask, or our desires to multitask? So just some things I want to pose to you, and we can hopefully meet up later and discuss them. And again, the next time we're going to be talking more specifically about media multitasking in our daily lives, and some more concrete consequences of, you know, how these brain limitations translate into what we actually do, and how it affects us socially and health-wise. And I really hope you'll join us. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.